Nancy Bainan. I am one of the co-managers at Arcadia Books. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight to talk about these two very powerful and pertinent books. We could probably talk for hours about how these books just dovetail. You might not think between a book about a mill town and a book about horrific sexual assault that there could be overlap, but there definitely is, and so many pertinent things to what's going on in this country right now. Kerri Arsenal is a book critic, an editor, and a writer whose work has appeared in numerous publications. Milltown is the story of her what felt like ideal childhood growing up in a paper mill town, and the realization as an adult that that paper mill led to numerous tragic deaths in the town, now called a cancer town. Excellent, wonderful book. I said, taking a drink of water, I was a little bit hesitant after reading the book.
Sorry.
Lacy Crawford's first novel is Early Decision. This, her memoir, Notes on the Silencing, is a heart-wrenching yet empowering story of her tragic sexual assault as a young teenager, and how she demanded to be heard and was not going to be silenced and let these people get away with it, what they had done with her, to her. Kerri's going to read from her book a little bit, and then Lacy is going to ask some questions, and then there will be time for you in the audience also to ask questions. So with that, Kerri Arsenal.
Thanks, Nancy. First, I have to also add that Lacy's book is so beautifully written. I reviewed it in the Boston Globe, and the language she uses to describe such horror is so beautiful. It's hard to understand that, but it is. So, bravo.
Thank you, Kerri.
I love that book.
Thank you. I want to say too, but just before you read, Kerri, that Kerri and I knew each other over the phone about a decade ago because we were both involved with an online literary magazine called Narrative Magazine, which is run out of San Francisco. And I had just moved, I think, to New York City. And Kerri, you were still in Curacao, weren't you?
No, I was in Oakland.
Were you in Oakland then? But,
yeah.
Had you just returned from Curacao, or were you on your way to Curacao?
From Sweden, yeah.
Returned from Sweden and on your way to Curacao or something. Yeah. Kerri's husband was in the Coast Guard, so she moved every few years. And so Kerri and I did a lot of work online and on the phone together, but we never met. And then we both went separate ways from this literary magazine and discovered, I think just last year, as we both had nonfiction books coming out around the same time, that we shared the same agent. And I have been really dumbstruck by a lot of the parallels in our lives, which otherwise appear to be as far apart as they could be for two straight white women from, largely Eastern United States, Eastern Central United States. I grew up outside of Chicago, not far from the Wisconsin border, in a well-to-do suburb called Lake Forest, and was sent to a New England boarding school, a very prominent and so-called elite New England boarding school when I was 14. And I was sexually assaulted there by two seniors when I was 15. I did not know for 30 years the extent to which the school had gone to cover up that crime. What I did know is that this school is one of the small educational institutions that purports to train the boys and men who become the leaders of most of our cultural, political, and industrial and corporate institutions here in the country. Lately, we can boast Bob Mueller as one of our alumni. So there's, the failures of civility and many, many others. But Kerri, who, as you'll hear more tonight, grew up in Mexico, Maine, in a town that was entirely wedded to the paper mill that straddled the river between Mexico and Rumford, which was the town on the other side, if I'm understanding correctly. Very much a working class family. Kerri is unusual in that she is a working class writer who is permitted to have her vocation be writing, be an author. So I think it's very difficult to make that jump for anyone, but particularly people who are not born with enough privilege and resource to float themselves for the decades it takes to make that happen. And Kerri's book is very much about her community's dedication to and devastation at the hands of the mill, and the way in which the working class people, the largely Acadian people, and we can talk about that a bit, community were used like a natural resource, as surely as the fresh water of that river was used, as surely as the white pine was used as a resource for the paper mill. These people's bodies and their labor was used as a resource. And the founder of that mill, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps from age 14 and founded the mill in 1903, when he finally struck it rich in the old-fashioned American way and had himself a son, he sent his son to the very same boarding school that I was sent to. And his son sent his son to the very same boarding school. And his son sent his daughter's son to the very same boarding school, who played tuba in the band as recently as the 80s. So we sort of occupy different portions of the same constellation of what is effectively white patriarchal capitalist supremacy, not to put too fine a point on it. But we didn't know any of these things. And we didn't know for sure that one of Kerri's 86 jobs, which I hope you'll start by talking about, was working as a nanny for 4 kids in the rich summer redoubt of Prouts Neck, Maine, one of whom, the oldest of whom, would become one of my dearest friends in college, and not coincidentally one of the first people I talked to about my rape. She's been one of my dearest friends. So, so we have a lot to say about loyalty and privilege and class, and the way that class preys on some people to the exclusive benefit of others. So maybe you could start by reading a bit from Milltown, and then we'll talk a bit about how you came to write the book.
That was so perfectly said. Yeah, I can't believe how our paths did not cross until now. But I'm so glad they did.
Boy, that's for sure.
That is for sure. Yeah, I'm just going to leave. It's right at the beginning of the book. It's just a very short section. I won't put everybody to sleep here. It's just me talking about when I was a kid. My parents shaped their own well-worn paths. When my father walked back and forth across the mill footbridge to and from work, my mother lugged laundry up and down the cellar stairs, day after day, one skinny arm cradling the laundry basket, her free hand gripping a Vantage, a cigarette brand whose packet featured a bullseye graphic design. With a screech and a whack, the screen door would slam shut after she elbowed it open. She would dump clean laundry on the kitchen table, snap each article of clothing 3 times, fold them sharply into tight wedges of fabric, and stack them like the reams of white paper my father brought home from the mill. When the screen door wore out, my mother replaced it with a new one that already came equipped with a squeaky spring. She left it defective, announcing herself into infinity with only my father to hear. His hearing, long dulled by the hum of paper machines, was the perfect match to her perpetual clamor. My mother, she'd let her Vantage expire before finishing it and send me to fetch her a new pack from the corner store. "I'll time you," she'd say. "Now go." And off I went. She didn't need to tell me twice. Things stayed in this balance, with minor adjustments every now and then, until America's working class towns started to ebb alongside the industries that nourished them. The future? We knew nothing of it. Our horizon trembled like a fragile convex meniscus, brimming away from the landscape that held it. All of what was before us was not as bright as what had passed.
So Kerri, when you were a senior at Beloit College in 1990, and you were majoring in English, what did you know of your future? What did you anticipate was ahead for you? What did you hope was ahead for you? And how had that been forged by where you had come from?
Actually, I wanted to be a war correspondent. I had these fantasies of, I had read all these Time Life books my parents had, and there were pictures of these, like, you know, journalists pictures, and I wanted to be a war correspondent. So I majored in journalism and English. And when I was a senior, I applied for internships because that's what I was told to do. I was a first generation college student, so I didn't really understand what to do. And I got an invite from Mother Jones magazine, which was perfect. But they gave me nothing, like a small stipend, and expected me to move wherever they were. I think they were in California. Yeah. I think they were in California, and they were like, you can come work here. And I was like, what? My student loans were huge. And I was like, I have to make money. So I went home, actually, because my mother was the secretary at the high school there. And she said, well, there's a job here for you, after I fiddled around in the Midwest for a while. So I went back to my old high school and lived with my parents and worked at the high school as a phys ed teacher. And then I did, and a health teacher. And then after that job was over in the winter at Christmas. So I was a ski instructor. And then it just kept going from there. And I wrote an essay in the New York Review of Books called My 86 Jobs. I started working when I was 15. And there was a New York Times editor or reporter who reports in the Northeast called them the mayonnaise adjacent jobs, which I loved because so many of them were just, you know, it's like waitressing and making pizzas and every just kind of scratch job you can imagine. I have done it. So from there to becoming a writer, you know, everybody says, how'd you become a writer? How'd you get out? I'm like, well, I worked 86 jobs. That's my kind of short answer. But it was hard. Not, you know, there were a lot of things that happened, I think, in between that and my job as a writer. You know, I graduated from college in 1990. There was a huge recession. My father had been subject to a union strike. There were, you know, our town started sort of, was really hurt by that strike, I guess, to make it short. Globalization came and didn't hit our town. It just came and went like a shooting star. And, you know, our town just became less and less, you know, globalization came and the new products were information, it wasn't manufacturing. You know, the manufacturing started to die back. Dreams and ambitions started to leave that town. And I was still part of that town. I was still living with my parents after college and trying to, you know, and go back and forth between, I actually lived with my parents and I would go to that nanny job in the summer too. In Prouts Neck and worked there during college. Anyway, so I think really the only, you know, between the first job when I was 15 and the 86th job, which was just like last year, I think I actually have an 88th job, but we won't talk about that. I got another job.
I look forward to hearing about that.
I can't stop. I think what really got me, I married my husband in 2001 and he was in the military. It's not like he was wealthy. He came from a sort of white collar family. His father ran a car dealership in Western Mass. It wasn't anything fancy, but he had come from a little bit different background. He paid off the last $3,000 of my student loans when I was 35. And we got married and then we moved to Sweden in 2006 and he said, do you want to be a writer? You can be a writer now because you're not allowed to work here. So it was really because of his generosity and his job that I was able to even be a writer, or even to think about being a writer. So I didn't write from the year I graduated in 1990 to college till about 2009.
Did that feel like a defeat, all of those years?
Yeah, it kind of still does in a weird way. Like everybody's like, well, your books, you know, you got good critical reviews and you're doing well, but it was like, you know, I'm 53 years old. It feels like, yeah, it still feels a little bit like a defeat. Like I'm still not quite like where I want to be at this point. Like I wanted to be there 20 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever.
So I think one of the things that's so extraordinary about this book for anyone who's listening tonight who hasn't had a chance to read it yet is that Kerri, and we'll start a little bit to talk about the mystery at the heart of it and the detective story that you unravel, but you approach this book as a person who is resolutely from Mexico, Maine, who grew up there. Your father was a pipe fitter at the mill for 40 years. Your grandfather before him worked at the mill. And there was every expectation that you would stay, you know, and be raising 8 children who work at the mill right now, or still teaching at the high school, or whatever you might have done. And you approach the book not as an investigative, you're not an environmental scientist, you're not an investigative reporter. There's certainly plenty of investigation in the text, but it is a sort of hybrid document in which you return home again and again, and you chase down the lines of a few, I will call them crimes. I will call them crimes. And effectively what you unravel is something like a cover-up, but the cover-up is culture-wide, and therefore it's very hard to point to the bad guys. There's no Darth Vader sitting in the corner, I mean, I think we can certainly look at Boise Cascade and, the way they handled the unions and the way they fought striking employees and the way they, really broke the integrity of individuals who are skilled craftsmen who'd been there for years and years. But for the most part, I think the story, it seems to me, begins with your grandfather's death. Is that right? Can you tell us a bit about how this started?
A little bit of both grandfathers' deaths, actually, my mother's and father's. It started way back in 2001, which is not in the book. The book takes place between 2009 and 2019, but in 2001, I found a obituary of my grandfather's, and it said all kinds of information that I hadn't known about him, and I ended up finding out some of it was wrong. And it, being a curious person and a nosy person and a person who doesn't like to let things go, I wanted to find out what was wrong and what was right, and then what else could be wrong in the history of our artifacts, So his death really kind of started that off, his death certificate and obituary. And then the second death was my other grandfather's death, when I went home in 2009. Actually, when I was working at Narrative Magazine, where we both were working. That's another story. And I went there, and suddenly something struck me. It just felt it. I ran into a woman on a walk with my mother that we had this really strange interaction that really threw me. And I said, God, the town seems so different. You know how it is when you go home and your town is looks so strange. Everything looks small or like weird and warped. And she was like, no, you're the one that's different. So it was this really kind of an impetus in a way of thinking about my role in that town and how I was both an insider and an outsider to a place that I had come from and that I really identified with. So I started thinking about, I was doing a little bit of writing about this now, but that event, her just saying that really made me think, how do I interface with this town and what does it mean? And it really didn't even start with the environmental stuff. Like you said, it started with these deaths, actually, and it ends with death too. I mean, they're just like, it's a death sandwich. Sorry. I should just tell people the book's kind of funny, just so you know. It's not morose, but it does start with death, and it ends with death. But yeah.
All the spectacular awkwardness of having to go home and through various phases of your adulthood.
All kinds of that.
Go with your mother on a walk with the neighbor or the lady at the grocery store or whatever it is, which I don't think ever.
Well, I should tell, so one time here's an incident. I go into the grocery store and hey, Kerri, nice to see you. Where do you live? And I'm like, Connecticut. And they're like, Martha Stewart lives in Connecticut. I'm like, yes, but I don't live like Martha Stewart. But then I thought, well, in comparison, maybe I do, compared to these sort of, 2-bedroom, really kind of low-slung houses in Mexico, Maine that, you could buy one for $20,000. My house was a lot more than that. So it was that constant tension between myself and myself.
So how would you characterize your childhood in Mexico? What does it mean to be from there instead of from away?
I have such beautiful memories of my childhood, backyards teeming with children. It was a large French Catholic community. My best friend was the youngest of 13, and my next best friend was the third of 15. And I do name them all in the book. All the families, I remember exactly where their houses are. There are kids, 5 kids over here, 6 kids over here, 3 kids over there.
And you're one of 6, right?
No, 5.
5, okay.
In the middle of 5, 2 older sisters, 2 younger brothers. So just us and the neighborhood. We had massive, soccer games in the backyard, we would just go stay out and nobody locked their doors, and we just come home with the 9 o'clock whistle, which was when the mill would blow the 9 o'clock whistle, and it meant kids go home at night, which was very sweet, you know. Yeah, it was pretty great, you know. It was very safe, and all the other parents looked after you, and that kind of neighborhood. It was the 70s. There was nothing crazy going on.
And the paper that the mill was making was the fancy coated stock that for the, you know, all of the 20th century was used quite literally to sell the American dream. So this is the paper in the Sears catalogs and the paper in all the glossy magazines. So when I was lying on my bed turning the pages of,
oh my God, yes,
whatever I was trying to force myself to become, that paper had been produced using the trees and the water and the bodies of Mexico and Rumford, Maine. And what was going on at the same time, I was really struck by the fact that as kids, you all laughed about and almost found endearing the fact that your whole town smelled of sulfur and that the river was dead and nobody would have gone swimming in the river or certainly fished from the river, and that this was just how you were raised.
Yeah, I mean, what did they call this? One guy called them shit cakes, excuse my language, but shit cakes floating on the water, and, you know, walls of foam.
I've seen that. Yeah, I've seen that in New England.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that too, because I was thinking about this the other night. I was talking to somebody, and maybe it was you I was talking to, but that smell, that sulfur smell, it also reminds, like when I drive into town and I smell that smell, it reminds me of home.
So it's almost a kind of mother's milk thing, but
Right.
the smell was in fact what? I mean, what was it?
Yeah, it was sulfur dioxide, mostly the smell. I mean, but smell isn't everything. You know, there were other things lingering in the air that we couldn't smell that were probably even far more dangerous that we didn't know about. You know, the rainbow colored water in the river, sure, you could see that, but the stuff but the stuff in the mill snow, we called it mill snow, was dark, black.
Oh my God.
All our clothes, it would get our clothes sooty. There was even one point men's coins would tarnish in their pockets. My father, he always took a shower before coming home. But he still had that mill smell on him. It was just so pervasive, you know.
I mean, I don't know, because when I read that part about your father showering, you know, when he was a pipe fitter, so he wasn't even in the bleach room. And I hope you'll tell us about the bleach room in a minute. But, you know, now my husband is in healthcare, and you know, so many of these clinicians are having to strip naked and shower, you know, the minute they get home before they are exposed to anyone in their family because of the risk of COVID. And that's pretty gratuitous to do that. You know, they know that they're being extra careful, but this is something that your father did by rote every day for decades. And it is amazing to me. I mean, was any of this perceived as a threat or a risk, or was there ever a consideration that this wasn't the way it was in other towns, that the snow maybe shouldn't be black, that,
you know, people in the 1940s complained, and it was really bad then. Things were just boiling in the river, basically. And then for a long time, it was, you know, post-war, you know, really people were doing well and the economy was cranking. And I don't know, it was the price we pay. We all pay a price every day for things, choices we make. You know, if I order something from Amazon, I'm hurting my own book publishing industry, and I'm ordering boxes from who knows where, and this from that, and the gas that it takes to get there. You know, I don't know. And it seems like such a harmless act. And that's like a harmless act. These guys were actually making good money and healthcare and pension, and sent 4 of us to college, you know, on that dime. But there was a point in the 1980s that 1980s and 90s that some citizens did try to take some action, but it was ultimately frustrating and a dead end road.
why? Can you talk about why?
Yeah, it's really hard. I should say this, it's really hard to connect pollution to disease. You know, I mean, pollutants aren't provincial. Who knows if you're getting cancer from the pollutants from our mill, or from China, or from California, or from Minnesota. We don't know. You know, where did you go for the past 10 years? What did you do? You know, there's so many factors, it's really impossible. So they tried to connect the high disease rates in our town with the environmental pollutants, and they did find some information, but ultimately science says, you know, it's based on a factor of uncertainty. You know, science doesn't say this equals this, hardly ever. I mean, it's very hard. So they left with saying, okay, here's the data we found, but we can't really say for sure, you know. And if you can't really say for sure, then the mill is like, okay, you know, they kind of, and I shouldn't just say it's the mill too. I want to explain to everybody here that it wasn't just our mill as some bad guy. There's a lot of different levels of them. You know, there's the lobbyists of the paper industry. There's the state government, the federal government. Everybody is kind of on all these different layers. And in the research I found, you know, the EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, was basically in bed with the paper industry. There's a whole thing on my website called the Poison Papers. That's what it's called, this resource database that they found and they proved, and they took them to court, and they were proven to be, you know, in collusion with the paper industry, the EPA. So there's a lot those people were dealing with in my town in the 80s and 90s. Not only that, but they're just like, you know, here I am working on this book for 10 years, and it took a lot of time. I mean, I had to research not only the history of my town, my family, this mill, but like science, the EPA, dioxins, mercury, benzene, landfills, boilers, you know, like millions of topics of research that I had to go kind of get proficient on. And I almost went insane doing it. I mean, somebody brought it up. They're like, you had to learn about this. I never even thought about it, but I did. And so for an ordinary person that's just working like 9 to 5 or 7 to 3, as we did in the mill, that's really hard. So that's where they ended up. You know, at the end, they couldn't prove anything. So people just sort of gave up. And you know,
one of the things I think you were up against is that it wasn't a matter of the mill having to prove that what it was doing was safe for the employees or their children, but rather the employees and their children having to prove that what the mill was doing was not safe, which means undermining your own livelihood effectively. Right. Because if you're not going to support the mill, then you leave, and where is one to go, right? Particularly if one has ties and deep roots in that community. Yeah. Tell us a bit. I would love to hear a bit about the Acadian community, that heritage, that tradition. I'm not sure if that's represented at all in the Northern Great Lakes region. I think it's primarily New England and then Louisiana. But certainly there are some analogous groups, immigrant groups from the end of the 19th century. They certainly didn't suffer the way the Acadians did, but they still remain in some ways enclaves, in my experience, certainly having grown up there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
You know? And I would love for you to tell us too, just a little bit about dioxins, because this certainly is not public knowledge, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah. First, the Acadians were, how to make this short. The Acadians come from the maritime provinces in Canada, which is mainly Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, in the land that was called Acadia, but it doesn't exist anymore. Because in 1755, after years and years, or decades, I guess, of back and forth between French and British jurisdiction, finally the British came and said, you're out of here, ethnic cleansing 101. You're getting out. We're putting you on ships. We're sending you across the world and down in New England. And then the New England people came up and burned the houses of the Acadians, and it was a forced expulsion of an entire population. So my family hid in the woods up there, the Arsenault family, and until like the Brits were finally gone, and they repopulated up in Prince Edward Island. At least that side of the family. I have a lot of different Acadian families. So anyway, long story short, they up in Prince Edward Island in the late 1800s and 1900s. I can't remember how many millions. I have a terrible memory, but a lot, let's just say a lot of Acadians and French-speaking Canadians came down to work in the textile mills and the paper manufacturers in New England. They were really the backbone of the Industrial Revolution here.
This is extraordinary. The statistic you give in the book is that it's almost 1 million French-speaking Canadians who came primarily to the textile and paper mills of New England between 1840 and 1930. And that prompted me to look up the population of the United States in that time, which during that span grew from 17 million to much larger. But the point is that this population was a not insignificant percentage of the population of the young United States. And it's a story that I certainly was never taught. You know, I mean, I was awash in Pilgrims and Founding Fathers.
I would too.
You know, and as were you, I didn't know there were French-speaking Canadians in the U.S., you know, or French speakers in the U.S.
Making paper and clothes.
Making paper and clothes for me. Thank you very much, French-speaking Canadians in the U.S. Right. So, but the extraordinary thing is that the KKK was there. You know, the Night Riders were doing their thing with your ancestors at a time that I was not aware that this sort of, what's the word, homicidal bigotry, you know, was being perpetrated in that place in that way. And it does seem to have created effectively an underclass that American industry feasted on for 100 years.
Yeah, it's funny, the KKK, I just learned something else. So I should say the KKK was very active. There were like 50,000 members in Maine alone that had a very anti-French Catholic agenda. And I just learned something the other day in Vermont, because there were a lot of French Canadians in Vermont, they were right on the border, you know, Canada. There was a eugenics program up until 1957. With French Canadians and Abenakis in the native population that was the Micmacs were was a tribe of people that this was a tribe that up in Acadia when it existed, the French, the Acadians and the Micmacs actually were dependent upon each other and sometimes often married or had kids together, were not hostile with each other, put it that way. But yeah, there was a eugenics program. Just found that out like 2 days ago. So it was pretty, you know, the French Canadians and the Acadians were treated pretty poorly in Maine, and looked, you know, there are really echoes of the kind of racism you even see now. I would compare them more to Mexicans coming across the border because they came on foot, you know, they were coming in trains or on foot, and the kind of rhetoric that is being used against Mexican people was similar to that, perhaps worse. I don't know. I can't speak for what is happening in the South as much as I can tell you what happened to my ancestors, but I would closely link it with that kind of attitude towards the same, even the way the workers were treated or are treated, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and they, you know, the Acadians too, I should say, were, you know, Catholic, so therefore like very loyal and very family oriented, and they would really, as a people, they would just pretty much do what was needed to get done. You know, I think that combined with this sort of Yankee New England thing, everybody just kind of put their nose down and did what they had to do, which I think fed a little bit into the conundrum that, you know, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather faced. But to them, maybe it wasn't a conundrum. I'm not sure, that was your original question. I'm not sure that people thought that this was bad. I mean, here's a picture I'm looking at right across from my desk, and there's a picture of like guys in overalls and their bare feet standing next to the paper machine. I mean, you know, if they didn't think that was dangerous, you know, this huge, I should get this picture. Hold on, it's right here. Can you see it? Is that, can you see that? No, maybe not.
Yeah, no, we can.
Yeah. So, you know, they didn't think that was.
Oh my God, it's huge. That thing is huge. That machine is enormous.
Yeah, it's really big. They're the size of like, I mean, they're even bigger. I went and visited the mill, and it's the size of like a small, you know, department store, one machine. Huge, loud, and hot and dangerous, you know, open gears. You know, if you look at this, they're open gears, you know, you could just, it just felt like metaphorically too, it just felt like death was nigh, you know, constantly. It just.
What did you learn when you were there? I'm leading the witness, but the bleach room just gets me every time.
Yeah, no, I know the bleach. So I should say my father's father, William, worked in the bleach room, and when paper is bleached, it creates a very dangerous byproduct called dioxin. And it's one of the most dangerous carcinogens in the world ever made, ever. In very small, I don't even know how to say ever, in very small amounts, even like the smallest amount you can imagine, which is like, I don't know what that is because I'm not a scientist, but very dangerous because it bioaccumulates, meaning it goes up the food chain, it gets stronger, it gains strength, like
Concentrated.
like a superhero villain, you know?
Right, along the food chain, yeah.
The food chain, and it's accumulative, so it just, anyway. So dioxin is made in that bleaching process, and my grandfather worked in that bleach room, and what I found out, he died of cancer, stomach cancer. What I found out during my research of this book, I talked to a woman that worked in the human resources, probably at the time that he was there. She said that they would hire the older men to work in the bleach room because they were basically about to retire, so if they worked in the bleach room, they also knew that they were probably likely to die soon after retiring. So they wouldn't have to pay them all their pension and benefits for too long, is what she told me. So that was my grandfather.
And how many years after he retired did he die of stomach cancer?
Oh, it was just a few. I think it was like 2 or 3. But he had been sick for 2 or 3, so he could have been sick right after he left, even. You know, and dioxin, it sounds like this is all in the past, but guess what? It's not. I mean, they have cleaned up some of this process, and it's a lot less dioxin that's going into the air and the soil and the water, but it's still going in there. And it actually is created when, say, wildfires happen too. Like unmitigated dioxin is happening right now all across our country. It's the same chemical that was in Agent Orange, if that helps anybody understand how dangerous it is.
So the EPA knows how dangerous it is, and yet,
yeah, the EPA did a draft study. They started it in 1985. They studied dioxin because back in the 80s, dioxin was a dioxin scare. People were freaked out. They found it in tampons and diapers and paper products. Even just touching it, you could absorb some of it. Molecules, like tiny, tiny amounts, but over a period of time, as I just explained, it's bioaccumulative and it's persistent. The half-life is like 11 years, right? So they found it in all these products. Then they found it in the food supply in the fish downriver from our paper mill. In fact, some of the highest concentrations in the nation in our fish in our river. So they were like, oh no, what does that mean? So basically dioxin accumulates very wonderfully in the fatty parts of animals that we eat. And there's no escaping that. So the EPA found all this stuff. They've been studying, and they had all these teams of scientists. I think they spent something like $40 million in the 80s on this study for years. And they were coming up with 2 reports. One was a non-cancer study and one was a cancer study. They took the non-cancer study and said, here's the things that are non-cancerous that could happen from dioxin. It was like suppressed immunosystems, things like that. And in the cancer study, they were like, they didn't do anything with it because the paper lobby and industry and everybody put so much pressure on it. They just went and they put it on a shelf. And what that study said is basically what I'm telling you now, is that it's so carcinogenic and it's so dangerous that one expert told me that if that report were released, it would have devastating and irreversible impact upon our entire U.S. economy.
So right, we appear to be at this odd impasse where you say something that should split the sky apart.
Right.
I mean, this should change everything. This should be an emergency, certainly in mill towns, if not everywhere, and it's not. And your book is understood one way, an exploration of why not, right? What are the barriers that we put up personally and socially and culturally to reckoning with what's really happening, what's really being done? And I think your father's character in the book is a good example of someone feeling his way through this. Can you tell us a little bit about his experience and what happened while you were working on this?
Yeah, so my father, 45 years, he retired. It was 2013. I was in the middle of writing this, literally in the middle, and he got sick. He had asbestosis from working with pipes in the paper mill, which, by the way, when he showered, asbestos, I come to find out, doesn't wash off. It actually comes home with you. So it's probably in my lungs too. So he had asbestosis, and that can develop into lung and esophageal cancer, which it did with him. And when he was diagnosed, or when he started going to the doctors, he didn't want to know what was wrong with him. He didn't want to know his diagnosis. And then within a year and a half, yeah, he died. He died in 2014, the day after Christmas. And I don't know, I think, I'm glad he didn't know, in a way. Like, he didn't want to know. I don't know his reasons for wanting to know. I'd like to think it's like twofold, right? He just wanted to live without just thinking, because everybody in our town, it was always like his biggest fear was getting cancer. I remember him telling me that. And then to get it, like, he kind of knew, but he didn't want to know. He didn't want to, because everybody got cancer, you know? I mean, in my book, you know, there's probably 5 or 6 people in my book that I interview and talk to that get cancer and die.
Yeah, and they don't have it in the beginning. Yeah,
right.
You turn the page and now they've got it too. I mean, it's like a shooting gallery in there. It's remarkable. Yeah.
That's a perfect way of thinking. And including my father. So he wasn't even the impetus of the book. It just happened. So, you know, his not wanting to know is just to try to live, and then just to be like, I don't know, maybe how would you feel? I don't know. He knew what I was kind of writing about in a way, but not exactly. I mean, I would read him the funny parts, you know, mostly. I didn't want to, you know, I also didn't want to put that on him either. Because how do you tell your father, you know, you made the thing that's killing you? Like, can you say that? You can't say that.
You can. I mean, it might not be recommended if your dad's, you know, fighting cancer. But I think, I mean, there's a larger question here. And then I want to turn to questions from people who are listening to us tonight. But one of the things you handle really beautifully and with a lot of balance is the political affiliations of your community in Mexico that came out strongly for Barack Obama during the 2 elections when he was on the ballot, and then swiveled all the way to the other side and came out very strongly for Donald Trump. And we find ourselves now in a position in the nation where those communities that are most devastated by the absence of environmental and industrial regulation are those communities that are most strongly in favor of a president who wishes to deregulate even further, which is a paradox that I find it difficult to understand. I recognize that it's my privilege that allows me that confusion. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Whether or not with regard to Mexico is up to you. Mexico, Maine.
Yeah. I want to start with a quote from Robert Kaplan, who wrote this book called The Coming Anarchy. He was a writer for The Atlantic for years. He wrote, think of a stretch limo in the potholed streets of New York City where homeless beggars live. Inside the limo are the air-conditioned post-industrial regions with their trade symmetry and computer information highways. Outside is the rest of mankind going in a completely different direction. So in short, when Trump ran for president, he might have been in his limousine too, you know, and we were all going, this working class town is going in a completely different direction, un-air conditioned, unprivileged. But Trump was the one that opened his limousine door and said hello. It really was it started with that simple act. Whether he lied, it doesn't matter. And no matter what he says, it doesn't matter. These people had been bludgeoned for 50 years economically, identity-wise, like we talked about the strike a little bit, but really economically hard. And they saw him as some kind of like hope, just as they had seen Obama as hopeful. Both men being very different from anything we had seen in our presidency, I venture to say, right? You know, so I think they saw him as some kind of, you know, just blow the system up. you know, and Trump was also somebody that we understood. Like when I was in 8th grade, I went to New York City for the first time, and guess where we went the first place? Trump Tower. To like,
Really?
yes. Yes, we went to Trump Tower and looked, and I remember standing in the lobby and looking at the escalators and just being like, this old gold tinged fantasy was like, when working class people I'm not going to say it's for everybody, but I'm saying in general, it was a thing. It was like, we didn't really appreciate the white collar, the doctors and the lawyers. We admired the rich people. It was like this thing. It's like, you're rich. We don't, you know, doctors and lawyers, oh, they think they're better than us mentality, right? It still exists there, and I can feel it in my bones. I don't feel that way, but I'm saying I know that feeling. Like they think we're better. And Hillary to them was like that. Like she thinks she's better than us. And Trump was like, just, yeah, we know he's a liar, whatever. But there it is. So I understand why they voted for him. They saw him as just, I even directly after the election, I thought, well, maybe for these people, he will offer some kind of something. I don't know what it is. It could be nuts, but it would be something different than the status quo of the last 40, 50 years, which has been stagnant and eviscerating, actually, not even stagnant, eviscerating to towns like this, manufacturing towns.
And instead it's gotten worse, I would argue, with regard to healthcare and the economy. I mean, that's not for me to speak to. We have a question that dovetails with this, which is a rave about how stunning Milltown is, and it's true. So just a wonderful adventure back through your hometown. The question is, how has your hometown reacted to the book?
Personally, I've had a lot of people emailing me. A few things have been said. One is like, thank you for seeing us. Thanks, I'm glad we're being seen, and thank you for writing this story, which surprised me.
And is that about seeing that they have been endangered, or seeing that you give them their complexity? Right, okay.
Yeah, I think, I mean, somebody actually said that. That's like something I would say, and they were like, I feel so seen or something. And I was like, whoa, you know, it was really, I mean, this is an isolated, you know, this isn't like fucking Chernobyl or anything, you know, it's not like a big deal. It's a small thing, but it's accumulative, and it's toxic, and it's uncertainty they've been living with in this rural, isolated town. Yeah, it's just it's a small kind of violence that's been happening, a slow, small violence that you know, people in the larger world don't see. So when they saw my book was like recommended by Oprah, they're like, finally somebody, you know what I mean, to be seen in that way. More, and Acadians too, you know, I've had a lot of Acadian people reacting in the same way. It's like, oh, finally the Acadian story is going to get like some kind of national discussion, you know. So there's been a few people that have had interesting reactions, just like in general about, you know, I'm going to remember this town the way I want to remember it, like very stubbornly, like, and I'm like, but that was a bad thing. You know, it's this very confusing thing.
But this is interesting, and you and I have talked about this, and I don't know that we've got to the bottom of it, if one could, but what people remember in many ways is what you remember, which is there was a lot that was wonderful and felt safe and secure about growing up there, which I think if we were to consider Make America Great Again, divorced somehow magically from the context of all of the racial dynamics that have adhered to that and that are behind that, a certain fantasy that I think many people of our generation have, that there was a kind of softness to childhood that has somehow disappeared. And whether or not that's nostalgic, which is to say it never existed, it's a false memory, you know, is unclear. But I do wonder, there is something, I could not be more liberal with regard to this election, but there is something to the nostalgia that I share. Yeah. I just disagree with the way to get back to it, right? Or to try to move forward toward it. Do you have a sense, there's another question, do you have a sense of where your community will come down in voting this year, in another month?
I really have no idea. I don't know, because I haven't been back in over a year. my mother moved the day I finished my book. So I've heard there's a lot of Trump signs, but that doesn't mean anything.
Doesn't?
No, I think they just put more signs out. I do. I think
They do. Yeah, they do around here too. And it's like helpful, you know, where not to trick or treat.
right. I don't know. They might, because again, sort of nothing has changed, and they look at Joe Biden as like, you know, Obama or Hillary. He's just kind of establishment, you know, blah blah blah. And we all sit here and go, oh my God, he's done this, this, and this to eviscerate even more. But you know, there's no New York Times newsstand there in that town. You know, they're reading the headlines, you know, the top level headlines. And I'm not saying people are dumb or ignorant. I'm just saying, A, they're busy. B, there's a lot of stresses to put up with. Like kids there are hungry, 4 or 5 kids are food insecure. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of drugs. There's a lot of problems. So, you know, trying to suss out whatever the New York Times or NPR is saying, it's just not on their priority list. They're trying to like feed themselves. And so you have to look at towns like that too. They're really trying to get like high level shit done, not worry about like, you know, what somebody's saying on NPR. So they're not looking at it as, you know, like peeling apart what Trump did or didn't do. It's really high level. So I don't know. I feel worried, actually.
Yeah, there's the sheer terror of the collapse of our American democracy. But
yeah, I mean, I feel worried, but I feel like Democrats haven't done anything. They've been complicit and complacent too. And they were in the last election. And I don't know that they've really seen these people again. I don't know if they're doing the job that they should be doing. So
I wish we had time for you to say more about what they should be doing. I'm keen about there's a question that's come up. Someone's asking, what do you feel you personally most took away from the experience of researching and writing the book? It was a 10-year project, right?
Yeah, what did I most take away? Well, I learned, I mean, everything I'm talking to you about, I learned in the last 10 years. I didn't know anything about Acadian history or dioxin or our history of our town or how a paper mill worked or like what my father did on a daily basis. I didn't know any of this. I was completely oblivious. So in the book, you actually see me researching. The book is basically me researching about this book in a way. And so you will go along, it's in present tense. So hi, Courtney. You'll see me going through that process of learning everything that I learned. And so I literally took so much away. But I think one of the most poignant things is what I was just talking about, is how our town could have turned to Trump, because it's a blue collar working class town, and it surprised me. But after researching and understanding what they've been through for the last 40, 50 years, I understand it. So that was a surprise and a disappointment at the same time.
It's a lovely thing that you do, though, because you were one of the, I think I told you after I first read the manuscript, is one of the first times that I've been able to feel a sympathy for people whose opinions are so wildly opposed to mine. I think it's very hard.
And I should say this too. Yeah, thank you. And I should say too, when I went home to research and everything, I wasn't like interviewing people. Like, what do you think? We didn't talk about politics. I have no idea who I talked to, who they voted for or what. I would just sit down and have coffee or go to their math class or go skiing with them or go to the bar. So on that level, I think that's why I feel like the book tells a story about these people is like sort of apolitically in a way. The only politics come up is because I bring them up, right? In the context of this. And what I realized too, Courtney, is that we all want the same things, you know. Everybody wants their kids to do well, be healthy, you know. I didn't know I still don't to this day, except for maybe some people's Facebook feeds. I can tell what politics are on, but otherwise we didn't talk about it.
Well, except that politics are bubbling down the river and boiling out of the smokestacks, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if there's one thing that I think we've learned in this last election cycle, it's how very rare the person is who can not pay attention to politics, right? I mean, you can define that however you want. You know?
I mean, I'm saying I wasn't into like addressing them, like, who did you vote for?
Oh, no, of course. No, of Of course. No, and those are some of the, I mean, I think that the project of going back home and figuring out what the hell was going on when I was young is like the most fabulous. I think you should do it.
Basically, that's it. It's just
for every hometown. It's like, you know, like the scene at the salon where they're like two Heidis. There's like old Heidi, new Heidi, and the new Heidi's been there 20 years. And anyway, a question has come. It seemed like you were born obsessed or naturally in love with history. And that's interesting because I've thought of you as a writer, not necessarily a historian. Would you agree?
I would say, hi, Karen. Karen went to Beloit. Yay. I would say that I am obsessed with my own curiosity. I'm just a really curious person. And I think you have to be a writer, first of all. It's like it's the absolute thing that you have to be. So I'm really curious. And I was always very dogged about finding answers to my questions. So I don't know if it's history in general, but I became a lover of history during the course of this project, like really finding out how the past ties to our present day. And that's what I'm in love with, not necessarily like history in and of itself, but like how it connects. And in fact, like I know we're going to do book group with some of these people here, and like my last chapter, 16, ties into chapter 1, and chapter 15 ties into chapter 2. It's kind of like the past and the present are connecting themselves in those chapters, or at least they were in the first draft or the third draft, I mean. But yeah, so I fell in love with that to try to understand the past. Really.
Can I ask a question about resentment?
Who, you or somebody there?
Me.
Yeah,
Me.
go.
Yeah, and then there's a beautiful compliment that's just come in that I want to make sure you read. But so when you moved back home because you couldn't land, you know, the gig coming out of Beloit that would pay off your loans and get you started in journalism, which is hardly unique, you know, I mean, that's the deal for almost everyone, which is why most people who get to go into journalism are people whose parents can pay for their apartment in New York while they're getting on their feet and so on and so forth. And you went over the summers to Prouts Neck, which, you know, you can't even buy a house in Prouts Neck. You have to know somebody who's selling one. They literally don't list them because the families hold on to them. Now, to me, this is what money looks like. Donald Trump is not a rich person where I come from. He's ridiculous and embarrassing. The rich people, you have no idea how much money they have. You never see it. You just literally don't even know how to get to where they live because they've made it that way. And they're protected from everything, right? So how do you not resent, and the reason I ask this is because it's germane to your book, is that you approach everything that you discover with a kind of equanimity that means that there is no pity and there's no grievance, and there's just a great deal of sort of goodwill, which is part of the tone. It's why it's funny. But why don't you resent the hell out of someone like me? I mean, I resent me a lot of times.
I know, you do. You give yourself a really hard time more than
I do. I was given a lot, and it took a long time. I'm still figuring that out, and I'm just very curious how you've navigated to where you are now, which is, you know, you're kicking serious buttocks in the, you know, publishing industry, and you don't come in, you know, trailing clouds of grievance, and I'm just very. It's a wondrous thing.
Two things, maybe. I think I had good parents. They were like really nice and normal, and they just encouraged me to do what I wanted to do. And I also played a lot of sports. This is still part one. Played a lot of sports, and my father was like, if you have bad sportsmanship, you're not playing.
Mm-hmm.
It basically started from there. You're out. He would kick my ass, and I would be not playing. So I had to be a good sport, A. And then secondly, that's just my personality. I've always been like that.
That's true. Yeah.
I feel like I'm not a very judgmental person. And I'm a Gemini. I see both sides of everything, painfully so. I can almost never decide things because I'm like, I can see both sides equally. Should I stay or should I go? Maybe I'll just go down the middle. Yeah, I just think that is my personality. I'm not a stressed out person. I don't know. It's really, the book has my voice in it in so many ways. And I think that's the biggest part. That's who I am. I really try to look at people fairly and then judgmentally. And
It's such a tonic right now. It is the opposite of the derision and the divisive tone that we see everywhere, you know, truly. And this is a question.
Like I should say this too. I feel like I stick up for the underdog, if anything, because like I feel like these
That's
people
true.
are the underdog. I don't care who they voted for. I feel like viciously like defensive of them.
Well, no, and that's clear in a way that's lovely and creates space, I think, for other people to think about things differently. This is a question. You've spoken to the heart of America's working class. I would suggest also spoken from the heart of it. Do you think they might see their reality as not dissimilar from the struggles of people of color and find common ground to seek solutions? And I've heard your answer on this, and it's like a manifesto.
Yeah, I think the right in America, I think since the Civil War, I have a book, it's right here, you can get it, it's called Merge Left by Ian Haney Lopez. The right has been so successful at dividing the working class along racial lines that they even have us thinking about it. So I'm not going to talk about race because my family is white and this is about my family, but I would say that I think that we can look at working class as working class, and we should really start doing that. That's not to ignore the struggles that race is having and has in this country. That's a totally separate thing. I'm just talking about working class as compared to, you know, upper class, whatever. People who I don't resent.
A lot of critical race theory has illuminated the ways that some of the elite white industrial capitalists managed to use racism as a way to cleave away white working class from working class people of color.
Right.
To, you know, generate sort of division among people who might otherwise rise up against, you know, the capitalist overlords is probably a bit of a cartoonish phrase for that, but who might otherwise be allied in a certain way. And you know, there are echoes of that in your book. It's beautifully and delicately handled, particularly when we talk about the passion for everything white and the bleaching of paper. And I love the fact that your book is not on bleached paper, that it's actually, you know, no fish were killed in the making of this book, right?
Or people that I know of.
More people, we hope, right? There were no tumors grown in the making of this book.
That's a really fascinating thing, though. You know, they studied the fish and they studied the this and they studied the water. They never really studied the people. You know?
Well, why? Yeah. Well, here you are. I see Nancy coming in, so I want to read one last thing because I know we're 7 minutes late. But so you've got from Lynn Hawthorne, excuse me. She says, Kerri, I loved the book. I grew up in Oxford County, lived in Portland, and moved to Wisconsin. We had some overlap, I guess. Reading the book was bittersweet and so informative. Thank you.
Yeah, I learned a lot too about our Oxford County. That's the county my town is in. I learned a lot too.
It's a wonderful book, Kerri. And if more of us could think this way and read this way, I think we would find our way toward answers. And it would be a better conversation than the one we're having now. That's for sure.
So, one question for you. Somebody says, Lacy, great job interviewing. How long did you prepare to do this today? I'm going to answer for her. She's very smart.
No, I got to read this book in manuscript because we have the same agent. And so it was sent to me when it was a big sloppy mess. And that's awesome because I got to see what Kerri tightened up and what she jettisoned and what she kept. And that tips me off to I get to see behind the curtain, you know? So it's kind of like I saw the tech rehearsal and then I saw opening night. So I know exactly what she chose to bring forward. And that helps me understand where her heart was, and that's where I want to go. So, but also I just really love Kerri, and so it's fun to talk to her. And I love her book.
A lot to talk about.
We do.
Still, we're on different.
Here's the good part. This hour went by way too quickly, but Kerri's going to come back next month, and Lacy is more than welcome to come back next month as well.
Thank you.
Because Lynn's right, you're a fantastic interviewer, Lacy. Thank you.
It's really good. I know. I'm going to bring her along with me wherever I go.
I'm happy to do that.
You're hype woman.
Yeah.
So Kerri's going to come back and on the 13th of October, and we're going to have a book club. So I think after everybody gets a chance to read the book, or people that couldn't join us tonight will have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about it.
It'll be fun.
Yeah, it's great. All right, I cannot thank you two enough. I mean,
Thank you, Nancy.
Oh, you're just both so intelligent and just so much.
That was such a nice conversation. Thank you.
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I feel like I learn something every time I talk to Lacy. I learn something about me, my book, and the world.
That's my job.
Thank you.
So if you want to see about or hear about our other events, you can visit our website or get our newsletter. But thank you again. Thank you, both of you. And thank you, everybody.
Everyone, please vote. Vote, vote, vote. Whoever you vote for, vote. Stay healthy.
Vote for life over death.
Your lives. Your lives.
Your lives. Everybody's lives, regardless of
Yes.
political affiliation.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, Melanie.